They moved the way trained infantry always moved, quietly, in broken lines, rifles forward, eyes working the earth and the tree line as if reading a familiar language. There was no enemy fire to answer them, no cracking rifles, no sharp, metallic stutter of machine guns, only boots pressing into damp soil and the low hiss of breath inside wool and leather. It felt wrong. Silence in war is never neutral. It is a kind of pressure. Then the earth ahead of the lead file ruptured. Not with the clean violence of an explosion, no concussive slap, no shower of stone and steel, but with flame. A sudden sheet of orange and black that rose from the ground itself, as if the soil had inhaled and exhaled fire. Smoke rolled outward, thick and oily, and the men nearest it stopped without being ordered to stop. Instinct caught them by the throat. Someone shouted, "Mines!" Another swore it was fuel, spilled, hidden, waiting. An officer raised his arm to signal halt, but the gesture looked small against the sudden wall of heat. Before anyone could decide what it was, a second line ignited, closer, wider, advancing along a shallow curve that seemed to anticipate their path. The flames did not scatter randomly. They marched in strips, as if drawn by a careful hand. The first screams came from the edge of the fire. A boot caught, then a trouser leg. Wool flared. Men stamped and slapped at themselves, but panic makes every movement clumsy, every breath expensive. A soldier fell and rolled, smoke swallowing him. Another ran the wrong way and met fire again. Orders burst from the officers, back, spread out, keep low, but even as they shouted, their eyes searched for a cause, a shell, a device, a trigger, anything that fit the world they understood. And in that moment, before any explanation arrived, the first realization formed, silent, absolute, and horrifying. This battlefield had found a new voice. The ground itself had been turned into a weapon. When the first flames thinned, the survivors did what soldiers are trained to do after any strike. They looked for the signature. They crawled forward in short, cautious movements, eyes scanning for craters, those blunt, familiar mouths in the earth that explained everything. But the ground was strangely intact. No bowl of torn soil, no scattered stones, no jagged wound where a shell had landed. The grass was scorched, yes, and the top layer of dirt had blackened into a brittle crust, but the terrain had not been thrown upward. It had been lit. They searched for fragments next, shrapnel, fuse caps, metal bands, anything that would let them name the attack. There was none. No peppering pattern on nearby trunks, no splinters driven into helmets. Only burns, faces blistered raw, hands wrapped in trembling cloth, men coughing until their ribs ached because smoke, not steel, had entered their lungs. And then they noticed what made the fear sharper. The fire did not spread like accident. It moved in deliberate strips, long bands of ignition that traced the ground as if a line had been measured and marked. It appeared, held, and then advanced, not outward in chaos, but forward in purpose. A gust of wind pushed the flames, and instead of dispersing harmlessly, it seemed to help, driving heat directly into the German positions, forcing them to backpedal and compress into the few safe patches left. The medics were overwhelmed not by bullet wounds, but by men who could not stop shaking from pain and shock. Water was scarce. Cloth stuck to skin. The air itself became hostile, hot, thick, and bitter. Whispers spread faster than orders. What is this? Not a bomb, not artillery, not a minefield as they knew it. There was no name for a weapon that left no crater and no fragments, only fire, arriving like an answer to a question they hadn't meant to ask. And because it had no name, it could not be argued with. Confusion hardened into terror, pure, clean terror, because the mind could not file it under anything familiar. They lifted their heads and searched for the obvious. Tree lines, hedges, a distant ridge, any place an enemy rifle might flash, any hint of movement that could explain the flames. The Germans had learned to fear what they could see, a gun muzzle, a tank silhouette, the glint of optics in morning light. Visibility was comfort. It meant the battlefield still followed rules. But there were no muzzle flashes, no bursts of tracer to chase with their eyes. No whistle of incoming shells, not even the blunt thud of a mortar team working behind cover. The fire came without warning sound, as if it rose from the soil by decision rather than by impact. The weapon's signature was absence, an attack that announced itself only when it was already upon them. Men began firing anyway. It is difficult to do nothing under threat. So rifles cracked into empty brush, machine guns stitched the edge of a field, bullets cutting leaves and bark with no target to receive them. The noise was not combat, it was fear trying to make itself useful. The panic brought its own cruelty. Platoons bunched together, seeking reassurance in closeness, exactly as training had warned them not to. Spacing vanished. The safe gaps between men, those thin margins that keep one hit from becoming 10, collapsed under the pressure of heat and smoke. The ground offered fewer paths, and every path felt like a trap. Officers tried to impose order, but the old commands lost their authority when the enemy could not be located. Spread out. Hold the line. Advance. Words built for visible threats, for a war of angles and distances. Now the battlefield answered with flame, and the men listened to the flame more than to the voice. Smoke thickened, turning the world into a narrow tunnel of choking air. Shapes moved inside it, friends, not foes, but in that dimness every shadow seemed armed. Someone shouted a warning and fired. Another returned fire, not knowing from where it came. Confusion made enemies of silhouettes. And through it all, the fire kept arriving, silent at first, then roaring as it took hold, until it felt as if the ground itself was speaking. In that moment, the Germans understood a new kind of terror. Not simply being attacked, but being attacked by an enemy they could not see, could not hear, and could not answer. The German army had been built on a particular faith. Not faith in luck or in miracles, but in legibility, the conviction that battle at its core could be read and therefore mastered. Every exercise, every doctrinal pamphlet, every lecture in a barracks classroom reinforced the same assumption. Threats have signatures. Weapons have recognizable effects. If you can identify the cause, you can select the counter. A machine gun announces itself by rhythm, artillery by whistle and impact, tanks by sound, by dust, by the heavy certainty of their tracks. Even mines, treacherous and hidden, left patterns that engineers could map, probe, and clear. The German method was to turn chaos into sequence, locate, fix, flank, destroy. It was war rendered into steps. That is why the first ignitions struck deeper than the burns. They did not simply injure men, they violated the mental order that held men together. The ground had erupted without the expected chain of cause and effect. No crater to measure, no fragments to examine, no firing position to suppress. The battlefield offered an event without an explanation, and the mind, trained for answers, began to stall. Unseen weapons had always existed in rumor. Stories from the last war of gas drifting without warning, of forests rigged with traps. But rumor was not reality, and German officers were educated to treat it as exaggeration, something soldiers told each other in the dark to give fear a shape. Now the fear had shape, and it was the earth itself. Officers still searched for rational patterns, because discipline depends on them. They expected the phenomenon to fit a known category, to behave in a way that could be predicted and countered. But each time the flames appeared, they did so with an unfamiliar logic, too deliberate to be accident, too silent to be artillery. In a well-drilled unit, confusion is temporary. Here, confusion became structural. Men looked to their leaders for explanation before they looked for solutions. And when explanation could not be supplied, belief, this German belief that war must be understandable, turned from strength into vulnerability. Because what cannot be understood cannot be controlled. For years, German victories had taught a dangerous lesson. The world could be forced to behave. In Poland, in France, in the early drives eastward, speed and coordination had broken opponents before they could reorganize. Problems were solved by momentum. Resistance was handled by procedure. The battlefield had seemed, again and again, like a machine, complex, but ultimately predictable to those who understood its gears. That history sat behind every order. So when unusual reports rose from the line, men describing flames without shells, ground that ignited in strips, many commanders treated it as the oldest soldier's disease, panic dressed as story. Fear always invents, exhaustion magnifies, a nervous mind turns smoke into mystery. In staff tents and command posts, officers preferred explanations that protected their assumptions. Allied tricks, spilled fuel, accidental fires, anything but a new method, anything but the suggestion that the enemy had changed the rules. And because they believed the Allies relied mainly on blunt force, artillery, massed infantry, predictable airstrikes, German command often chose speed over caution once more. They told forward units to keep moving, to push through, to treat the burning ground as an inconvenience rather than a system. Keep going, the message implied. It's nothing. But on the ground, nothing was screaming men and blistered skin. Nothing was a heat wall that turned a confident advance into a stumbling retreat. Each time officers dismissed the danger, the next ignition arrived like a rebuttal. The most corrosive part of arrogance is not cruelty, it is delay. It delays belief in the evidence right in front of you. It delays adaptation. It delays humility. It delays the moment a commander admits, even privately, that he is no longer certain. As more strips of fire rose, disbelief began to fracture discipline. Men obey orders less cleanly when they suspect the orders are rooted in ignorance. A soldier will face danger. He will even accept death. What he cannot accept is being led into something his leaders refuse to understand. The German advance had been built on confidence in familiar war. Now, familiar war was collapsing. When denial finally cracked, it did not shatter cleanly, it bent. Orders shifted in tone, if not yet in clarity. Units were told to bypass the burned ground where possible, to edge around blackened strips and test alternative routes forward. Maps were unfolded and refolded, fingers tracing paths that looked safe on paper. The assumption remained that this phenomenon could be worked around. But the terrain refused cooperation. Fields narrowed into lanes. Hedgerows funneled movement. Marshy patches and shallow ditches forced men back onto the same few firm approaches. Each attempt to disperse ran into the same problem. The land itself encouraged clustering, and clustering, they had already learned, invited fire. Engineers were pushed forward, their probes tapping cautiously into the soil. They searched for pressure plates, wires, buried charges, anything recognizable. They found nothing that fit their training. No metal signatures, no detonators. The ground was warm in places, brittle in others, but structurally untouched. It gave no answers. Smoke became the next enemy. It drifted low and thick, erasing landmarks and swallowing distance. Men lost direction within a few dozen meters. Signals were missed. Hand gestures vanished into grey air. Radio traffic surged, not with reports but with questions, every unit asking what the others were seeing, and no one able to explain it. Morale did not collapse all at once. It sagged. Soldiers sensed that something fundamental was missing, a countermeasure. In every other situation, training offered a response: spread out, dig in, suppress, flank. Here, each response felt provisional, improvised, fragile. The struggle had begun, not against an enemy formation, but against uncertainty itself. They were still moving, still armed, still under command. Yet for the first time, many sensed that the fight was no longer about winning ground. It was about surviving a weapon they could not yet define. And a soldier who cannot define the threat can only guess where to place his next step. The fire had never been random. That truth emerged slowly, like an outline through smoke. Somewhere beyond the German line of sight, the Allies had prepared the ground with patience rather than firepower. Fuel, cheap, plentiful, and easy to hide, had been buried in shallow caches or fed through concealed lines. In other places, dry material had been soaked and covered, waiting not for impact but for timing. The terrain itself had been turned into a system. Ignition did not require an enemy standing at the front. That was the elegance of it. A match, a flare, an electrical trigger, even a timed device could begin the sequence. What mattered was not the method of lighting, but when it was done. Observers watched German movement and waited. Only when units committed to certain lanes, when boots, vehicles, and weapons massed in predictable corridors, did the fire come alive. It rose not as a reaction, but as a decision. Coordinated across distance, ignitions functioned like artillery, except there was no arc to track and no battery to silence. German movement itself became the signal. Each advance fed the mechanism. Each attempt to push through confirmed the Allies' calculations. The Germans were not walking into a trap, they were powering it. Geography, once neutral, had been rewired into a fuse. The weapon was brutally simple. There was no advanced metallurgy, no complex machinery. Any army could have done it. That was the quiet humiliation of the moment. Innovation had not arrived through superior technology, but through superior imagination. As this realization spread, so did unease. If the ground could be prepared days or weeks in advance, then nowhere was truly safe. If ignition could be triggered from a distance, then killing the enemy at the front changed nothing. The battlefield had depth now, temporal as well as spatial. Innovation had won not by meeting force with force, but by turning patience into a weapon. And for the German troops on that scorched ground, the most unsettling thought took hold. The enemy had been waiting. Once its purpose became clearer, the fire revealed its true function. It was not meant merely to kill. The ignitions rose in places where roads narrowed, where hedgerows converged, where natural cover forced men into alignment. Flames cut across these routes like doors slamming shut. What had looked like open ground moments before became impassable, not because of rubble or wreckage, but because heat itself dennied passage. Retreat was shaped as carefully as advance. In several sectors, fire erupted behind forward elements, severing the thin threads that connected them to support units. Radios crackled with urgent calls for repositioning, only to fall silent as smoke swallowed antennas and operators alike. Platoons found themselves isolated not by enemy fire, but by burning air. The result was fragmentation. Units split apart, each piece reacting to its own immediate danger. Mutual support vanished. Heavy weapons, machine guns, mortars, even ammunition carts were abandoned where they stood, too slow to move through flame, too valuable to lose but impossible to save. Men chose speed over strength, survival over cohesion. Burn wounds carried a special cruelty. They did not kill instantly, but they reduced fighting ability with brutal efficiency. Hands could no longer grip. Eyes swelled shut. Lungs burned from within. A soldier who might have held a position for hours became a casualty in minutes. Fire did not need to destroy units. It only needed to thin them. Confusion traveled faster than the flames themselves. Rumors leapt from group to group, of entire companies lost, of fire spreading in all directions, of encirclement that did not exist but felt imminent. Panic does not require accuracy. It only requires uncertainty. The battlefield narrowed into corridors of movement bordered by heat and smoke. Within them, men ran, stumbled, and collided, all reacting to the same invisible pressure. What the Allies had built was not a wall of steel or earth. It was a wall of denial. And once fire controlled the routes, it controlled the battle, without ever needing to show a single enemy face. Inside the burning corridors, war shrank to the scale of breath and skin. A squad leader, his rank meaningless now except to the men who recognized his voice, shouted for calm he did not feel. He counted heads again and again, not because the number changed, but because counting gave shape to chaos. He pushed men forward with a hand on the back, pulled others down when they froze, all while pretending he understood where the fire would go next. The men shed weight without ceremony. Helmets were flung aside when straps burned into necks. Packs were cut loose, straps hacked through with knives because buckles were too slow. A rifle was dropped, not in surrender, but because blistered fingers could no longer close. In those moments, doctrine dissolved. Survival made its own rules. Medics worked in conditions they had never trained for. Water was poured where morphine usually went. Bandages smoked when they touched skin. There were no clean wounds to dress, only raw surfaces that reacted violently to air. The medics' hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that they could do very little. A runner was sent through the smoke with a message scrawled on damp paper. He nodded once and disappeared into the grey. No one saw him again. There was no body, no confirmation, only absence which felt heavier than certainty. Yet even here, something else persisted. A man shared his last water without being asked. Another turned back briefly to pull a comrade free of a ditch, knowing exactly what risk that choice carried. These acts were not heroic in the grand sense. They were quiet, instinctive, and fleeting. Fear became physical. Every inhale burned. Sweat strung like salt on open skin. Vision narrowed to a few steps ahead, as if the world had agreed to reduce itself to what could be endured. In that heat and smoke, war stripped away its abstractions. There were no fronts, no strategies, no flags. Only men moving through fire, guided by nothing more than the will to keep the person beside them alive for one more step. The turning point did not arrive with a new weapon. It arrived with recognition. After the third and fourth ignition, patterns began to emerge in the minds of the survivors, those exhausted, smoke-stained men who had seen enough to compare one moment to the next. The fires were not appearing anywhere. They were appearing where movement was forced. Narrow lanes between hedgerows, shallow crossings, the firm ground beside marshy edges, the points where any sensible advance would naturally compress. Choke points. Once seen, it could not be unseen. This was not spilled fuel, not accident, not the battlefield misbehaving. It was engineered, prepared with intent, triggered with timing. The enemy was shaping the German advance the way a hand shapes water in a ditch, not by stopping it outright, but by guiding it into channels. Command posts received the reports, and for once the language shifted. The messages were no longer casual dismissals. They were cautious, clipped, urgent. Officers traced the map again, now with suspicion, as if every obvious route carried a hidden fuse beneath it. The first response was rerouting. Units were ordered to avoid the main lanes, to push through less direct ground, to find alternative corridors. But maps are promises. Terrain is reality. The alternatives were few, and worse, they were predictable. If the Germans could see them, so could the men who had prepared the traps. The Allies anticipated the detours. As fresh elements moved into a new corridor, another strip of fire ignited, clean, timed, devastating. It did not merely block the new path. It confirmed that the enemy's vision extended beyond the immediate front. The Germans were not outmaneuvering a line. They were moving inside a design. In that moment, initiative slipped away. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or because their weapons failed, but because decision itself had been stolen. Every move now felt like a reaction. Every choice seemed pre-approved by the enemy, already accounted for in the geometry of flame. The turning point was simple and brutal. They were no longer. An advance is not only movement, it is belief made physical. For days, German momentum had been sustained by timetables, hours measured, objectives named, distances reduced to lines on a map. But fire does not respect timetables. It waits. And then, when it rises, it turns minutes into decisions and decisions into losses. The first collapse was practical. Forward units stopped because they could not cross heat. Vehicles stalled behind burning strips, engines idling uselessly, crews staring at walls of flame that no tank could crush and no half-track could outrun. Supply carts and ammunition carriers piled up in the rear, their paths blocked not by enemy armor, but by scorched corridors that offered no safe passage. The second collapse was psychological. Officers began to lose faith in their schedules. Messages that once spoke in certainty, advance by, secure. Hold shifted toward hesitation. Attempt, if possible, report conditions. When command language weakens, discipline feels it first. Night offered no relief. Fire did not need daylight. In the dark, ignitions were worse. Sudden flashes turning the landscape into brief, terrifying daylight, exposing men mid-step, mid-fall, mid-panic. Shadows snapped into sharp outlines, and then vanished again into smoke. Confusion bred violence in the wrong directions. A sudden figure in the haze was fired upon. A burst answered. Friendly fire incidents multiplied, not out of malice, but out of survival reflex. The unit's cohesion, so carefully built in training, fractured into isolated pockets of men who could not see beyond the next few meters, could not trust what moved in the grey. And still, there was no major firefight. No decisive clash of massed forces, no dramatic breakthrough or counterattack. The battle's climax was the dying of forward motion itself, the moment an army built for speed found itself pinned by heat and uncertainty. Momentum did not end with a shout. It ended with silence between orders. From the Allied perspective, the effect was disproportionate to the effort. The materials were ordinary: fuel, cloth, dry ground, timing devices simple enough to be repaired in the field. There were no rare components, no factories required to manufacture the weapon. What made it powerful was not its construction, but its placement. Fire was positioned where it would matter most, and used when movement made it unavoidable. This economy was deliberate. Every ignition forced the Germans into choices they did not want to make: advance into heat and smoke, halt and lose tempo, divert into predictable ground. Each option carried cost, and all of them favored the defender. Fire did not need to destroy entire units, it only needed to shape them. Once movement slowed and formations compressed, the second phase began. Artillery and small arms, now guided by predictability, finished what the flames had started. German units funneled into narrow, safe-looking gaps were met by shelling and ambushes that suddenly made sense. Losses mounted, not as a single catastrophic blow, but as a steady erosion of strength, morale, and coherence. The casualty lists reflected the method. Burns, smoke inhalation, shock. Men evacuated not because they were dead, but because they were no longer functional. Each evacuation removed a trained soldier from the line for weeks, sometimes permanently. Fire turned manpower into a wasting resource. Reports reaching German command struggled for language. Phrases appeared that did not belong in formal military paperwork. Sudden ignition, unexplainable fire, ground burned without impact. These were not tactical descriptions, they were admissions of conceptual failure. The most valuable effect, however, could not be counted. Psychological shock hardened into paralysis. Units moved slower even in unburned areas, eyes scanning the soil as much as the horizon. Every step carried suspicion. Fear entered decision-making at every level, not as panic, but as hesitation. The Allies had paid little for this result. The Germans paid with time, momentum, and certainty. And in war, those costs are often higher than bodies. When the fires finally died down, the ground told a different story than the casualty lists. Charred strips cut across fields like scars, visible, undeniable, and silent. Abandoned equipment lay where it had been dropped in flight. Machine guns without crews, ammunition boxes split open, vehicles halted mid-route with no enemy damage to explain their position. The battlefield looked less like the aftermath of a fight and more like the residue of a sudden evacuation. After action, reports tried to impose order on what had happened. Losses were tallied, but the numbers misled. Many of the wounded were not dead, yet they would not return quickly, if at all. Severe burns removed men from the line for months. Smoke damage left others weakened, prone to infection, unfit for sustained effort. Each injury was a subtraction from future operations, not just from the present engagement. Medical units bore the strain. Field hospitals filled with cases they were not optimized to treat. Dressings ran short. Pain relief was rationed. Transport assets were diverted to evacuation rather than resupply. The medical tail stretched long and thin, pulling resources away from the front even after the flames were gone. Command language grew careful, almost evasive. Reports avoided clear attribution. Fire was described without explanation, damage without cause. This was not deception, it was uncertainty hardened into prose. No commander wanted to commit to an interpretation that might later be proven inadequate or foolish. Meanwhile, stories traveled faster than paperwork. Replacement troops heard them before they reached the line. Veterans spoke quietly of burning ground and invisible triggers. The terrain itself acquired reputation. Fields were no longer just obstacles, they became warnings. The true cost was not measured in bodies alone. It was measured in readiness, in hesitation, in the time lost to fear and recovery. The ground, once neutral, had become a symbol of vulnerability. And symbols, once planted in an army's mind, are difficult to up. The German response, when it finally came, was methodical, but slow. Countermeasures were drafted. Engineers were ordered to probe more aggressively, to test ground ahead of movement. Units increased spacing where terrain allowed, advancing in thinner lines that sacrificed mutual support for caution. Detours became standard, even when they added hours to operations. Every step forward now demanded confirmation. Each adjustment carried a price. Probing delayed momentum. Dispersion weakened firepower. Detours surrendered initiative. What had once been an army built on speed now moved like a cautious traveler in hostile country, measuring the ground before every footfall. The adaptations worked, partially, but they transformed the nature of the advance. The deeper lesson was harder to accept. This was not about advanced technology. The tools used against them were simple, almost primitive. There were no new machines to copy, no factory programs to replicate. What had changed was the psychology of battle. Control of movement had become as decisive as control of firepower. War was shifting, not toward ever greater destruction, but toward denial, toward shaping where the enemy could go rather than meeting him where he chose to fight. The battlefield was no longer just a space to be contested. It was a system to be manipulated. Within German bureaucracy, this realization moved slowly. Reports were filed, circulated, revised. Committees debated classification and response. Arrogance does not disappear at once. It erodes under pressure, layer by layer. By the time humility arrived, the damage was already done. The lesson that simple tools, precisely timed, could rewrite battle psychology was learned only after it had been paid for in burned men, lost time, and surrendered initiative. And lessons learned late in war rarely change its outcome. They merely explain it. Long after the battle moved on, survivors remembered the fire more clearly than the fighting. They did not speak first of bullets or shells, of charges or counterattacks. They spoke of the moment the ground betrayed them, of soil that had seemed ordinary until it inhaled and burned. Memory returned not with noise, but with heat, the sting of smoke in the lungs, the way flame erased direction and certainty in the same instant. When the field finally fell quiet, it looked deceptively unchanged. The fire left no monuments, no twisted wrecks to mark a decisive clash, only scorched earth, darkened grass, and a brittle smell that lingered in the air long after the flames had died. To a passerby, it might have appeared unremarkable. To those who had been there, it was unmistakable. Doctrine changed in its wake. Manuals grew cautious. Movement emphasized probing and denial. Officers learned to fear what could not be seen or heard, to respect the possibility of invisible triggers beneath their feet. The ground itself became suspect, a participant rather than a stage. The cruelty of the method lay in its impersonality. There had been no enemy face to hate, no gun barrel to aim at in return. Fire arrived as a decision, executed at distance, indifferent to courage or fear. It asked nothing of the men it burned, and offered nothing in exchange, not even an explanation. War had expanded its reach. When killing no longer required confrontation, the moral weight shifted. Violence became easier to initiate and harder to resist. The battlefield lost one of its last human limits. For the German soldiers who survived, the lesson stayed with them long after uniforms were discarded. They had watched the ground ignite, not because